Welcome, everybody, to Facts on Friday. This is the inaugural episode of what's going to be a weekly show that takes a critical look at some of the most important news stories of the past week. So, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you find it informative. So, I'll throw it to Misty right now, and we'll get started.
Okay, so the first thing that we really wanted to talk about, and it's something that we're going to need to discuss at length in more detail, moving forward. But the Maxwell trial is obviously taking place in New York this week. This was the first 5 days of testimony, and as I'm sure will surprise nobody in our audience, it's not getting any coverage whatsoever in mainstream media and a lot of alternative sources. Nobody's touching this story other than the usual suspects, Slow News Day, Whitney Webb, those kinds of people. So this is something that we need to be keeping a very close eye on. And obviously it's not just for, the very clear and obvious reasons that this is a high profile pedophile ring of elites. That's obviously something that needs to be looked at and we need to be paying very close attention to. But there are a lot of other really nefarious connections that we need to be paying attention to. Jeffrey Epstein and Maxwell both had connections to Israeli intelligence. Whitney Webb has done, we're not going to dive super deep into this today because we want to be able to sit back and examine the first week of testimony. We're probably going to do like a very in-depth segment on it on next week's show. But Whitney Webb has done, there really is nobody better. So Whitney Webb's work is kind of the source to go to as far as all of the connections that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell has. To all different kinds of really nefarious, high-powered, very wealthy people. There is a ton of connections that they have, and a lot of that was exposed. The little black book, the quote-unquote little black book, was admitted into evidence today. Some of the people who were in there were people like, we all know, Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Donald Trump, which Donald Trump has made very strong denials to the fact that he was ever on the quote-unquote Lolita Express, which was Jeffrey Epstein's private plane. So that has now, it's not looking good for him. Bill Cosby, Tony Blair, Chelsea Clinton, Henry Kissinger, John Kerry, Woody Allen, Melania Trump, a whole host of very powerful, very wealthy people are in these circles. And I don't think that will surprise anybody. And this isn't to say that anybody who's ever been on that plane or anybody who's ever been photographed with one of the two of them is guilty of anything, obviously. But I think that it certainly paints a very questionable outlook on these people and to what extent that they were involved and what did they know, which I think is really the big thing, because there are pictures of even the Pope now has been admitted into evidence with Jeffrey Epstein. So that's certainly something that we need to be paying very close attention to. These are very high power people. Again, these are people who are at the highest levels of government in this country and all around the globe. So again, this is something that we need to really we want to do like a very serious and comprehensive deep dive on, probably on next week's show. Like I said, this was the first week of testimony that we had in the case, so I haven't really had a chance to do like a really hardcore look at everything that was exposed. We do know that there were some of the things that were discussed in the trial this week. There was one of the victims, they named her as Jane. It's obviously not her real name, but to protect her identity, she was named as Jane. She gave testimony this week. Also, Jeffrey Epstein's former pilot of the so-called Lolita Express testified as well. A housekeeper. Some other people gave some testimony. We learned that Bill Clinton visited the White House 17 times during 1993 and 1995, which we're learning this was kind of the big time when they were rounding up all of these children for their little sex slave ring or whatever that they were doing. Jane's testimony was really difficult to listen to. She was 14 years old at the time that she was first introduced to Jeffrey Epstein. She was apparently attempting to get herself a career as a vocalist. He did the age old, I can help you out, girl. I'll use my connections to get you a career and all that stuff. and they groomed her, as most groomers will do, with gifts and with promises of favors and career opportunities and all of those things. And the next thing she knew, she was in the clutches of these two genuinely disgusting human beings. So a lot has happened. Some of the things that I want to talk about that aren't necessarily being discussed during the trial are some of the high profile people who coincidentally this week have been stepping away from or stepping down from their companies, their boards of directors that they sit on, charity organizations, all of this stuff. In particular for me, because I live right outside of Columbus, Ohio, Les Wexner just recently stepped down as the chair of the Columbus Partnership. And Les Wexner is somebody who is very thoroughly entwined in this saga. He has a lot of really nefarious connections. He is, a multi-billionaire turd. And he was the owner of Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie and Fitch, Bath and Body Works, I think. So he recently just stepped down from that. A multitude of other people have stepped down. I'm sure some of you guys have seen some resignations that have been coming through. Maybe you're making the connections to the Epstein trial or not. And I'm not saying that all of them are connected to what's happening with the Maxwell case, but it is a little fishy that all these people who are in very high positions of power, who are now stepping away from these positions of power as the Maxwell trial is unfolding. So, Jack Dorsey stepped down from Twitter. The CFO of CNBC resigned. The CFO of Walmart resigned. The CFO of Goldman Sachs resigned. And again, Les Wexner resigned. And that's not even all of them. There's a multitude of others. Not to say, again, that there are any connections to the trial, but it is something that I think that we should be taking a look at, just given the fact that they are so thoroughly entwined. These are people who were listed in the little black book, who were on the flight logs of the Lolita Express. So I think that these are connections that we need to be talking about, that need to be made. Not a lot of people, again, are covering this in any real detail. And I'm excited for us to be able to really sit down and take a look at everything that's happening in the trial that happened this week. It's obviously going to be a very drawn out trial. So there's going to be a lot. It's going to be a long couple of months. There are a couple of really great Twitter accounts who are following the trial. As you may or may not know, for federal court cases, no cameras are allowed. So again, one of the most important cases, that we're seeing in the country, and we have no direct access to what's happening. But there are some people who are, apparently there was a huge overflow room. So there are journalists who are there who are trying to cover this to the best of their ability. But there's Maxwell Trial Tracker, which is just Tracker Trial, @Tracker Trial on Twitter. Has been doing a really good job doing daily write-ups, kind of Craig Murray style. So, it's a lot. And anybody who wants backstory on Jeffrey Epstein and all of the Maxwell stuff, again, I cannot recommend highly enough the Whitney Webb material. She has done the most sourced work on all of these connections. And I'm not going to lie, it's kind of difficult to follow because there are so many people and there are so many moving parts to it. But Whitney does a great job of breaking it all down and kind of trying to make the connections very apparent and obvious to different levels of government, different levels of business. This is a really far-reaching elite pedophile ring, allegedly, we'll say, to keep ourselves out of legal trouble. But yeah, these are really disgusting people at the very height of power. And I think that it's not getting anywhere near the coverage it should, but as is the case with most really important court cases. So this is definitely something you guys want to try to keep an eye on if you can. Check out Whitney Webb's work. Other people have done an amazing job too, but I think nobody's done it better than Whitney. So next week we'll have a more cohesive segment, really kind of trying to break down the entirety of what we've learned in court so far. So definitely keep an eye out for that on next Friday.
And
so yeah.
I'll just add to that Jason Burmis has been doing some pretty good coverage of the trial on his Rockfin channel. And just an observation, if you compare the Maxwell trial to the Rittenhouse trial, the disparities are huge. And one could be forgiven for thinking that all of the publicity piled on the Rittenhouse trial was to deflect as much as possible from the fact that the Maxwell trial is going on. And I say one can be forgiven for that, not just because the charges being leveled in the trial and the moving parts of what happened in the Epstein Maxwell case are so far reaching, but also because there are weird things that have been reported, such as um, Ghislaine Maxwell hiring body doubles for herself and her brother to appear in public. So, given that background, those shady, to say the least, moves, it's worth taking everything we hear from any source who reports it about this trial with a grain of salt, because the people who are rightfully being targeted by this trial are masters of manipulation, to say the least.
Yes, the propaganda game is strong. And just I didn't mention this, but just in case anybody's wondering, some of the charges that she is facing is 2 counts of conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, 2 counts of transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, 1 count of sex trafficking a minor, 1 count of sex trafficking conspiracy, and 2 counts of perjury and efforts to conceal her and Epstein's efforts demonstrated by a pattern of dishonesty while under oath. 2nd count was added recently. And that information is coming from the Trial Tracker Twitter account as well. They're doing like a daily, they have a Substack if you want to follow that. They're doing, again, like a Craig Murray style Assange case daily write-up of what's happening in the trial and all of the, I mean, this is crazy. It's the things that are coming out in court, the things that are being exposed. It's significant and it's disturbing. And the fact that it's not getting any mainstream play at all is not surprising, but should also be disturbing, because this is, legitimate evidence of what we all knew was happening anyways. This sex trafficking ring. It's a child sex trafficking ring that is operating again amongst the people in the positions of massive power. Prince Andrew, Tony Blair, a couple different presidents. I mean, this is something that it's really far reaching, and the implications are incredible. And the fact that it's not getting any coverage in mainstream, and even some alternative sources are not really touching it either, is really bizarre to me. It's really, I mean, this has got sex, drugs, international intrigue, all kinds of, this is what stories are made of, right? This is exactly what you would want for like a clickbait, and everybody's going to be interested in this, and instead nobody's covering it. So we're going to be keeping an eye on the obviously we're going to take a look at this past week, and then next week we'll try to keep an eye on what's happening with that, and we hope to do like a more comprehensive segment. It's hard to really dive into it hardcore because it really is deep. It goes so deep, but we'll try to just give you guys the broad strokes of what's happening in the trial, in the courtroom, so that you can just kind of be informed about what's going on there, since it's hard to find sources of information on what's going down. So that's definitely something that's going to be interesting moving forward for sure.
Yeah, and just another note that I think, this is just my hunch, but I think a lot of media, especially independent media, are staying away from this story because, much like COVID-19 and everything that falls under that, some of which we'll be talking about later, it's a non-political story in that it's not partisan. It crosses all political lines, and so much of media is embedded in partisanship, and that's a big reason why a lot of outlets, even independent ones, won't touch stories like this, because they're much more concerned about their partisan affiliations and credibility than they are about reporting on something that is essential to be reported. So that's just a note there, and something to pay attention to going forward if you're following these stories. There are always reasons why certain outlets don't touch certain stories.
Yes. And it's unfortunate that there's I don't expect mainstream media to do it, but when independent sources shy away from stories as important as this, it's depressing. It makes me sad. It makes me sad. We need more people talking about stuff like this. But it's a lot easier to just do clickbaity stuff about the latest Cenk Uygur Jimmy Dore feud, so it's unfortunate, but there are people who are doing a really great job covering it. Magnus did a great live stream, I think, last night. Steve obviously has been covering it from the beginning at Slow News Day. Whitney Webb, there are people, like you said, Jason Burmis has been doing a great job all along. There are people covering it. There are sources. You just have to go out and find them and try to share this information around because people really need to know what's happening. This is a really big deal.
Right.
No question.
And just one last thing on that. It's, of course, the sex trafficking is important, but it goes far beyond sex trafficking. During the Trump era, we heard the word compromat endlessly with regard to Trump. But if you want to talk about serious compromat and blackmail of some of the most powerful and elite individuals on the planet, the Epstein Maxwell story is where you're really going to find that. Not in Russiagate, obviously, but you're going to find it here. So, of course, the sex crimes, which seem endless, that have been committed are of paramount importance. But the saga, if you will, goes much deeper than that.
Much deeper. A lot of Israeli intelligence connections. There's a lot of, this is legit espionage. This is legit. This is really like spy novel stuff. This is the stuff that you would read or like see in a bad spy movie, but it's real life. This is really happening. They all have these connections. They all have a lot of really incriminating evidence against people in positions of power, which is they're making every effort to, keep out of the public eye, which, a lot of that lends back to the reason why it's not getting any coverage. So yeah, it's much bigger. Like Jesse said, obviously the victims of these sex crimes should be at the top of our list. But it really is so much deeper than even just that. So yeah, this is going to be an interesting couple of months moving through this trial, and seeing it all play out and what exactly is exposed. Cause I'm already kind of amazed at the things that have been exposed in court, that nobody's talking about. The fact that Bill Clinton, Jeffrey Epstein visited the White House 17 times in 2 years during, kind of a crucial time during his building of this sex ring. That's very interesting to me. So, yeah, it's definitely gonna be something that I look forward to keeping an eye on. Hopefully more people will start covering it as it moves forward. We'll see. We shall see.
So on to another story, I suppose, that the press has been largely ignoring, which is the latest with Julian Assange.
Yes. And there's actually a couple different major stories that have come out about Julian Assange recently. Richie Medhurst did a great expose on the quote unquote assurances that were given from the United States prosecution about how Julian Assange will be treated if he is extradited to the United States. They try to claim that, we'd never go back on our word. Well, in fact, they have before. So it's still really weird to me that we're even having a conversation like that, because these are the people who were just exposed to be plotting to murder him. So your assurances mean precisely dick, in my opinion. So the fact that we shouldn't even be having this conversation. Number one, because you shouldn't be in jail to begin with. Number two, because the U.S. cannot be trusted. I don't know why anybody thinks that that's a thing. But that story is actually really quite involved. Richie has a great article up if you guys want to check that out. But today I actually wanted to talk about Matt Kennard from Declassified UK, and Mark Curtis as well. Did a great story recently. And this is not surprising at all. I'm going to bring the article up on screen so you guys can see it too. Maybe. Sorry, you guys know I'm not great at this stuff. Okay, here we go. So the Assange judge is a 40-year good friend of minister who orchestrated his arrest. So this is really just par for the course. All of the judges who have previously been involved in this case have had massive conflicts of interest. Lady Arbuthnot has like some financial ties to some defense contractors and all kinds of stuff. So this is really just another, pin in the cushion of how ridiculous this case is. So this article isn't long, so I'm going to actually just kind of briefly read through it. Lord Chief Justice Ian Burnett, the judge who will soon decide Julian Assange's fate, is a close personal friend of Sir Alan Duncan, who, as foreign minister, arranged Assange's eviction from the Ecuadorian embassy. The two have known each other since their student days at Oxford in the 1970s, when Duncan called Burnett the, quote, the judge. Burnett and his wife attended Duncan's birthday dinner at a members-only London club in 2017, when Burnett was a judge at the Court of Appeal. Now the most powerful judge in England and Wales, Burnett will soon rule on Assange's extradition case. The founder of WikiLeaks faces life imprisonment in the United States. In his recently published diaries, In the Thick of It, Duncan wrote in July 2017, quote, my good friend and Oxford contemporary Ian Burnett is announced as the next Lord Chief Justice, end quote. He continued, quote, at Oxford, we always called him the judge, and they always called me prime minister, but Ian's the one who's got there, end quote. In an emailed response to Declassified, Lord Chief Justice Burnett confirmed he and Duncan have been, quote, friends since university days, end quote. Duncan studied politics and economics at St. John's College, Oxford from 1976 to 79, while Burnett studied jurisprudence at Pembroke College in the same period. Duncan's diaries also show that as a foreign minister, he spoke privately to Lord Chief Justice Burnett in May 2019, a conversation that was not logged in government records. Burnett briefed him on a dinner he'd had with then Prime Minister Theresa May 2 days before. But Duncan told Declassified, quote, there was nothing that was required to be logged in government records, end quote. He and Burnett both said nothing related to their roles as minister or judge was discussed. Duncan served as a foreign minister for Europe and the Americas from 2016 to 2019. He was the key official in the UK government campaign to force Assange from the embassy. As minister, Duncan did not hide his opposition to Julian Assange, calling him, quote, a miserable little worm in Parliament in March 2018. In his diaries, Duncan refers to the, quote, supposed human rights of Julian Assange, end quote. He admits to arranging a Daily Mail hit piece on Assange that was published the day after the journalist's arrest in April 2019. Duncan watched UK police pulling the WikiLeaks publisher from the Ecuadorian embassy via a live feed in the operations room at the top of the Foreign Office. He later admitted he was, quote, trying to keep the smirk off his face, end quote, and hosted drinks at his parliamentary office for the team involved in the eviction. Duncan then flew to Ecuador to meet President Lenin Moreno in order to, quote, say thank you for handing over Assange. Duncan reported he gave Moreno a beautiful porcelain plate from the Buckingham Palace gift shop. Job done, he added. Which that plate's funny. We talked about that. We talked about that on the vigil last week. Duncan's diaries also highlight a birthday dinner held for him in June 2017 that was attended by Burnett and his wife. The dinner held at the private beefsteak club in London the day before the general election was a, quote, generous present from David Ross, end quote, Duncan noted. Ross, a businessman and co-founder of Carphone Warehouse, has funded an array of Conservative MPs, including Duncan, and gave the Conservative Party £250,000 to fight the 2019 election. Other guests include the Syrian Saudi billionaire businessman Wafik Saeed, long close to the Saudi royal family. Saeed helped negotiate the massive UK Saudi arms deal known as Yamama. Thank you. In the 1980s. Saeed's wife Rosemary was also in attendance in is another major donor to the Conservative Party and has funded Boris Johnson. She was a guest at David Cameron's quote, leaders group meetings of key party donors. Other attendees at Duncan's birthday party included William Hague, Duncan's close colleague and friend, who was foreign secretary when the UK decided not to recognize the asylum granted to Assange by the Ecuadorian government. Excuse me. Also present was Salma Shah, an advisor to Sajid Javid. When as Home Secretary, he controversially certified the initial U.S. extradition request for Assange. Sir Alan Duncan and Lord Chief Justice Burnett both told Declassified they have never discussed the Julian Assange case with each other, which, if you believe that, you're a fool. Of course they've talked about it. So this is really just another par for the course thing. There's so much corruption. There is a vast amount of conflict of interest swirling around this entire case at every level. So this is something that we need to be making noise about this stuff. This is insanity. The fact that he talked about the so-called human rights of Julian Assange makes me giggle. If Julian Assange doesn't have human rights, then who does? I mean, don't we all have human rights? It seems strange to me that's even called into question. So kudos to Matt Kennard. Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis as well. Declassified UK in general. They've done a great job covering the Assange case. And this is just another thing that they've uncovered and publicized. It's a hot mess. That trial is a hot mess, as well as the Maxwell trial. And it's no secret, as Jesse mentioned earlier, that both of these things are being desperately kept away from public eye. So we have to do our best to kind of try to get this information out.
Absolutely. And if you really sit back and consider the way these people like Duncan et al. Act and speak, you can see, I think, very easily how deranged they are, how this is almost a game to them.
Mm.
It's not a matter of human rights, let alone free speech rights, let alone rights for journalists, let alone rights for people who have been the victims of Western crimes by the UK and the US that WikiLeaks has done such a tremendous job of exposing over the years. Um, these people are so removed from reality that their alienation from just the common person oozes from every word they
Mm.
speak, from every action they take. Um, what kind of person watches from a live feed from the top of the Foreign Office and then celebrates with
With a
drinks
smirk on his face. Yes, they
after?
had a legitimate party. I mean, it's mentioned briefly in the article, but we covered this on the Assange vigil last week. They had like it was called Operation Pelican, and they were they were all given commemorative ties with pelicans on them, and they had like a party to celebrate, and it was this tremendous success for them. The destruction of press freedom. Uh, it's not
Yeah,
a good look.
and it seems like there's a real craving to get back to the good old days, like when they were negotiating UK Saudi arms deals. They can't let go of their former glory, so to speak. But these are really just deranged people who are detached from reality, that unfortunately still hold huge sway over what's left of any justice system in the UK.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the Assange trial has really laid bare. Um, I mean, we all knew that the UK was basically the US's little lapdog, but this has really laid bare that fact. They have completely demolished their own, personal reputation. As far as like having any moral authority on human rights or press freedoms or anything. So it's really, really exposed the UK for what it really is. And it's kind of amazing that it's happening out loud in broad daylight. Again, nobody's covering it, but it's not like they're really, trying to hide what they're doing. They've been very upfront about the fact that they know they don't have a case. I mean, they've admitted to it in court. They've had to change their case like literally in the middle of the 3-week hearings in September. First it was Assange is not a journalist, and then it was okay, he's a journalist, but it doesn't matter because we can do whatever we want. They can just continually get away with all of this stuff. I mean, the UC Global case is still ongoing. There's evidence that he was spied on, that other people were spied on. His, conversations with his legal team were spied on. That's a huge violation of his rights. And nobody is really talking about all of those things and what it means, what the implications for those things are moving forward for all of us. This isn't, again, I say this all the time, it's not just about Julian Assange. This is something that is going to impact all of us moving forward. So yeah, this is really kind of laid bare, and all of these just continual examples of the corruption and the conflict of interest that are just running rampant throughout this entire case is really kind of something to behold, honestly.
And it's worth noting that Sajid Javid, who's mentioned toward the end of the piece, who was then Home Secretary, is now the UK's Health Secretary, pumping the fear daily about COVID-19 and now Omicron in particular. Essentially lying to the public in news articles about how Omicron is being detected. And he, of course, replaced Matt Hancock, who was just as despicable as health minister, I should say. I don't believe it's health secretary, health minister. And Matt Hancock, of course, was essentially sacked for violating lockdown rules that he was so adamant about imposing upon the public lockdown rules, which destroyed lives, quite literally hundreds of thousands of lives. And as you'll see later, a little bit later in the show, it's the effects of those lockdowns are still destroying lives. The impact has been huge. So
Yes, and I think it's clear. We should make clear too that it's they very openly admit to planting stories. The day after Julian Assange's arrest, they planted a story in the Daily Mail, a smear piece. They do it all the time. It happens on a regular basis. The Guardian is a huge example of that. I'll say it again. The Paul Manafort story, which is ridiculous, is still on their website. Still to this day, you can go and you can find that piece of journalism on the Guardian's website. It is a thoroughly ridiculous piece of garbage. To make the claim that Paul Manafort managed to visit the Ecuadorian embassy, which at the time was the single most surveilled building on planet Earth, perhaps, without he didn't sign in. There's no video evidence. None of the staff members ever saw him there. And it's like a whole ass article on theguardian.com where you can go and read about Paul Manafort's sandy colored chinos when he went to visit Julian Assange. This is a thing that they've done consistently throughout the Julian Assange case. This is why it's so difficult to fight for Julian Assange, because there has been a decade-long propaganda campaign against this one man. A lot of time, money, energy, and effort has been spent trying to destroy Julian Assange as a human so that they could manufacture consent for the treatment he's receiving now. And all of that is starting to bubble up to the surface. And it's something that we should all fear.
Absolutely. So switching gears a little, let's pick up that what's just come out with regard to Syria. This was reported in the New York Times.
Let me get the right link. Hold on. Not that. Mm-hmm. Nope. Mm-hmm. Oh, is this the New York Times?
It should be an archive.
Yeah. I gotcha.
Today one.
I gotcha.
Past the paywall.
Right. Ugh, my computer is very slow, you guys. I'm sorry. Okay, let me share this on the screen for you guys so you can follow along. Jesse's going to run you through this. Here we go.
Yeah, so credit where credit's due to the Times for breaking this story. And it's quite a long piece, so I'll try to be as brief as possible going through it. But after it reports, actually, if you go back up really quickly, you can already see that it's problematic in that the U.S. hid an airstrike. They very purposely go with airstrike rather than bombing. And then dozens of civilians were killed. Throughout the piece, there's no specific number given of how many civilians were killed, but it ranges from 60 to 70, and then upward of 70 to around 80, which speaks to what we've always known about Western media when it comes to the Middle East or Western Asia, as some people like to put it, that they don't really care about civilians who die there, or anybody who dies there. So just if you could scroll up to that picture, because it gives a good idea of the destruction of what happened. So this happened on March 18 of 2019 in Baghouz, Syria, which is right on the eastern border of Syria. It butts up against the Euphrates River. And at that time, the Islamic State was holed up there in about a 1 square mile area, ostensibly being pushed out by the U.S. coalition, although that claim in and of itself deserves a lot of questioning. And never mind the fact that the U.S. is in Syria illegally, has been the entire time. And that doesn't get mentioned once throughout this very long piece. So that's another problem. So that's just to give you an idea of visually of the area we're talking about during the bombing itself. But if you go down a little bit, you read here in the second paragraph that without warning, an American F-15E attack jet streaked across the drone's high definition field of vision and dropped a 500-pound bomb on the crowd, swallowing it in a shuddering blast. As the smoke cleared, a few people stumbled away in search of cover. Then a jet tracking them dropped one 2,000-pound bomb, then another, killing most of the survivors. And these airstrikes were called in by a secretive task force called Task Force 9, which, as this piece later reveals, were pretty much given carte blanche to operate as they wished within Syria. And they probably still do, for all we know. But they had been on the ground in this area and claimed that they were under attack by IS fighters. They called in these airstrikes, unbeknownst to, as you'll see in the paragraph below that, the U.S. military's combined air operations center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And you'll see that just below that, somebody asked on their encrypted chat after the bombs were dropped, who dropped that. They had no idea it was going to happen. And reading through this piece, you find out that Task Force 9 is basically, their rules of engagement are if they perceive an imminent threat, then they can respond however they wish, including dropping 500 and 2,000-pound bombs
on children,
on women and children. But they were claiming that they were being attacked by IS fighters, and IS fighters were swarming the area. There were also calls made for help by the Free Syrian Army, which we know is really just a proxy of the U.S. and has worked hand in glove, I think it's safe to say, with Islamic State. So this story, while it's important that it's revealed, the details behind who's allied with who still remain very murky. And you'll see here, just below the who dropped that paragraph, that an initial battle damage assessment quickly found that the number of dead was actually about 70. So again, not really any concern focused on how many people were killed. And there was apparently a military lawyer present to determine if this was a war crime or not. He reported it up the chain of command. Nothing was done. If you scroll down a little bit, yeah, right here, this paragraph, leadership, quote, leadership just seemed so set on burying this. No one wanted anything to do with it, unquote, said Jean Tate, an evaluator who worked on the case for the Inspector General's office and agreed to discuss aspects that were not classified. So the Inspector General's office, that's the Defense Department's supposedly independent Inspector General, who apparently began an inquiry. And as Tate is pointing out, that the findings were stalled and stripped of any mention of the strike. So there were attempts made by certain military officials to report this up the chain of command and have it evaluated under the so-called laws of war. But it was essentially buried up until the Times broke this story. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see that it says the details of the strikes were pieced together by the New York Times over months from confidential documents and descriptions of classified reports, as well as interviews with personnel directly involved and officials with top secret security clearances who discussed the incident on the condition that they not be named. And then underneath that is the, I believe, the first mention of Task Force 9, which was in charge of ground operations in Syria. And it's notable to point out that the task force operated in such secrecy that at times it did not inform even its own military partners of its actions. And as I stated before, in the case of Baghouz, where these bombings occurred, the American Air Force Command in Qatar had no idea the strike was coming, an officer who served at the command center said. So, all that said, the Times broke this story. It talked to a lot of people involved with it, most of them on the condition of anonymity. Um, and a lot of them, it's hard to tell if they're telling the truth or if they're just towing the line, but they're saying, look, we tried to follow the rules here. We were concerned as soon as we saw the scale of destruction that occurred, but their claims are questionable at best, as this piece makes clear. So if you scroll down a little bit more, you can see that initially, just go up real quick, one more. But a thorough independent investigation never happened. And then it's interesting to note right below that, this week after the New York Times sent its findings to U.S. Central Command, which oversaw the war in Syria, the command acknowledged the strikes for the first time, saying 80 people were killed, but the airstrikes were justified. It said the bombs killed 16 fighters and 4 civilians. As for the other 60 people killed, the statement said it was not clear that they were civilians, in part because women and children in the Islamic State sometimes took up arms, which I find to be just an atrocious explanation and denial of
Mm.
what happened, which I think any fair-minded observer would agree was a war crime. And then of note there is that the New York Times sent its findings to U.S. Central Command, which could seem innocuous on the surface, but if you think to a little while back, the story that broke that the New York Times often runs its stories by intelligence agencies in particular before it publishes them. Um, that should be of concern, that it's reporting and then essentially working in concert with U.S. Central Command, which is supposed to be reporting on and taking to task, not information sharing with and working in cahoots, if you will. And then a lot of this piece is peppered with quotes that we've heard before after U.S. war crimes have been exposed. We abhor the loss of innocent life and take all possible measures to prevent them. Captain Bill Urban, the chief spokesman for the command, said in the statement, quote, "In this case, we self-reported and investigated the strike according to our own evidence and take full responsibility for the unintended loss of life," unquote. Well, that sounds all well and fine, but as we know from many past instances, that boils down to the military essentially doing nothing and hoping the story disappears. So if you keep going down a little bit, so here it mentions the Air Force lawyer, Lieutenant Colonel Dean W. Corsack, who believed he had witnessed possible war crimes and repeatedly pressed his leadership and Air Force criminal investigators to act. That did not happen. So eventually he reached out to the Senate Armed Services Committee, calling for an investigation. If you read through to the end of the piece, you don't have to go there now, but so far the committee has taken no action in investigating this. So take that for what you will. If you keep going down, right here, there was a good chance, he wrote, and this is Corsack again, that, quote, the highest levels of government remained unaware of what was happening on the ground, unquote. I just find that utterly unbelievable that the highest levels were unaware of what was happening on the ground. But so says Corsac. So take him at his word, if you will. I don't recommend it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, about the murkiness surrounding the death toll, here you see undercounted tolls, which, again, credit where credit's due. The Times does touch on that, though I think not as in depth as they should. And if you scroll down to that picture, you get a sense of this area, the geography, the people who were living there. And then the description is quite interesting. A member of the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, whoever they are, assists a group of people leaving Baghouz, Syria, the last Islamic State-controlled area, in March 2019. So this was right after, I believe, those bombs were dropped. So you see, those are largely, if not all, civilians. And even if there are some combatants, so to speak, mixed in there, it's hard to tell who's who. And that speaks to how really no thorough identification of who was on the ground there was made before these bombs were dropped, although the military claims the opposite. And there's a lot of apologetics that happen in this piece, quoting military officials as saying, we analyzed and assessed as much as we could. We struggled over this to no end. And in the end, it was out of our control because this task force operated basically on its own. So I would be very wary about believing what those officials have to say. But that's what they're putting forth. And then if you go down a little bit more, right here, I just wanted to make or bring up what happened with the drone strike in Kabul, Afghanistan at the end of August, which killed 10 civilians, including 7 children, which the Times, as in an earlier headline, you can see here, still refers to as a botched strike, which really sanitizes what happens. But the Times excels in sanitizing war crimes, so we shouldn't be surprised. And it's preposterous what they say after mentioning that strike and the military admitting to it. But that kind of public reckoning is unusual, observers say. There was no public reckoning in that Afghanistan strike. Nobody was held accountable. And that seems to be what's going to happen here, as we'll get to in a moment. But if you take a look at the numbers of ordnance that were used, it's just massive. Nearly 1,000 strikes hit targets in Syria and Iraq in 2019. And remember, this is all being done illegally. The U.S. has not declared war on Syria. The U.S. is occupying Syria illegally and has been since 2014. So 1,000 strikes in Syria and Iraq in 2019, using 4,729 bombs and missiles. The official military tally of civilian dead for that entire year is only 22, and the strikes from March 18, which this story is focused on, are nowhere on the list. So again, you just see how the military is all over the place with covering this up, trying to bury it, and being extremely clumsy in doing so. And it is worth mentioning that this happened under Trump's presidency. Right here, the Times admits or states that it was a foreign policy triumph for President Donald J. Trump. Not sure why they have to include his middle initial in there, but they seem to have a fetish for doing that. And we can keep going down a little bit. What's particularly interesting is that there were drones in the area providing surveillance, and the task force on the ground chose to use a drone that had only standard definition cameras, claiming that there was not one available with high definition cameras. That turned out not to be the case. There was one with a high definition camera. So it seems to be that this Task Force 9 wanted to inflict this carnage and did everything it could to make sure it was able to carry that out, including using a drone with standard definition optics, which if you've ever seen the optics of standard definition drones, they're horrendous. It's you might think you have a case of you might think that you're losing your vision looking at that footage. So there is that problem among many others. And here is what I was mentioning earlier about this task force basically governing itself on the ground. But there was a quick and easy way to skip much of that oversight, claiming imminent danger. The Law of Armed Conflict, the rule book that lays out the military's legal conduct in war. And I'll just stop right there for a second. The U.S. using its own rule book instead of abiding by international law, that's worth pointing out. But I think most of us know that that's their standard MO. So that allows troops in life-threatening situations to sidestep the strike team lawyers, analysts, and other bureaucracy and call in strikes directly from aircraft under what military regulations call an, quote, inherent right of self-defense, unquote. Of course, no mention there made of Syrians' inherent right of self-defense. So we can keep going down. There's some more detail here about Task Force 9. Particularly of note right here is that in Raqqa, which was basically leveled by the U.S. military, this Task Force 9 was implicated in nearly 1 in 5 coalition civilian casualty incidents in the region. So I think that statistic speaks for itself. This is basically just an unaccountable task force, if you will. And there's a photo of Raqqa after all the carnage that occurred there. But this task force is basically an unaccountable entity of some of the most highly trained soldiers that the military has. They can basically go on the ground and do whatever they want. Can keep going down a bit because this is quite a long piece. This is interesting here. Alarm at the CIA. Let me see here. So apparently even CIA officers working in Syria grew so alarmed over the task force's strikes that agents reported their concern to the Department of Defense Inspector General, whom we mentioned earlier, Korsak, I believe his name is, which investigated the claims and produced a report. But of course, the results of that report are top secret. But a former task force officer who reviewed the report said the CIA officers alleged that in about 10 incidents, the secretive task force hit targets, knowing civilians would be killed. So again, this is an unaccountable, marauding entity that has no concern for the laws of war, whether those are U.S. laws or international laws. We can keep going down here. Keep going down. This image is a good place to pause. So you can see in the left-hand corner, that's where in Syria Baghouz is located. And then in the blown up portion, which is labeled as Last Islamic State Holdout, you can see it's a very small geographical area that butts right up against the Euphrates River in eastern Syria. Um, and interestingly, it's if you scroll up just once, yeah, the caption says that only a small sliver of land remained in the Islamic State Caliphate in March 2019. So, caliphate there seems to me to be a bit of loaded language. There wasn't really much of a caliphate to begin with. There was captured territory, but it wasn't really any sort of official caliphate to my mind. So let's keep going down. There's a lot of information here, and I do recommend everybody read this piece. It is very revealing, despite the flaws of the Times reporting. So here we get into the fact that there was a high definition drone available. The task force did not use it. Circling above, it was streaming footage of the same patch of ground to the operations center in Qatar. Because the task force operated at a high level of secrecy, two officers said, the people in Qatar watching the high definition drone were not aware the task force was about to call in the strike. We touched on that earlier. And I thought the next sentence was a bit humorous in a macabre way. Central Command said the task force did not know that the better drone was overhead. Okay. Better equipped would be more appropriate, but we'll go with better in this case. So we can keep going down. This photo was taken apparently the day after the strike. And this this area that's bounded off in a rectangle is where ground zero of the strike supposedly was. And you can see there tents that people were living in. It very much looks like a civilian area, which is not to say that Islamic State fighters weren't there. But if one's being honest, it was by and large a civilian populated area. And not every civilian there wanted to be there or was on the side of Islamic State. But those details in and of themselves are still sketchy, and I don't know. It's doubtful we'll ever get the full picture of who was there and who was actually killed. So if we keep going down, you'll see that the entire attack took 12 minutes. So, these people were basically obliterated in 12 minutes for specious, if no reason at all. This gets into the failed investigation that took place, which we touched on earlier. You can keep going down. Let's see. This is interesting right here. David Eubank, a former U.S. Army Special Forces soldier who now runs the humanitarian organization Free Burma Rangers, with which I'm not familiar. I want to do some more research on that. But he walked through Baghouz about a week later, and according to him, quote, the place had been pulverized by airstrikes. There was a lot of freshly bulldozed earth and the stink of bodies underneath, a lot of bodies, unquote. And so if you just go up to the paragraph above that, it's very much worth pointing out that satellite images from 4 days after the strike show the sheltered bank and area around it, which is where civilians and supposedly IS fighters were sheltering from the airstrikes, but were hit anyway. They appear to have been, that area has appeared to have been bulldozed several days after the strike, which is very reminiscent of what the U.S. did in the first Gulf War. especially as pertains the Highway of Death, where an outright massacre occurred, and Iraqi soldiers and civilian casualties were bulldozed into unmarked mass graves out at Mutla Ridge in the desert, I believe west of Baghdad. But somebody correct me on that geography if I'm wrong. So if we keep going down, um, there's more about the bureaucracy and how this was shuffled all over the chain of command and nothing was done. You see there a report buried. Can keep going down. So what's interesting to point out here too is that the task force, in carrying out its crimes, let's be fair and call them what they are, um, in order to justify what they were doing, they would log false information about threats, immediate threats to their security, thereby letting them invoke their inherent right to self-defense, as we mentioned earlier. So that's something that um, I believe Corsac, the attorney who's supposed to monitor whether there are war crimes being committed, I think that he's pointed that out, but to no avail, really. So if we keep going down, there is another photo of the Baghuz camp. That was one day after the bombing. And after that bombing, the American-led coalition, let's call it for what it is. It's the American coalition, announced the defeat of the Islamic State Caliphate. And you can see there's smoke still issuing from the rubble. You can still see the tents. And then, as we just mentioned, within days, it was bulldozed over. Let's keep going down here. Keep going down. Yeah, it's worth noting that Gene Tate, who we mentioned at the beginning of this, he's really been the one pushing for justice to be done here. He was actually sacked from his job not long after he started to make noise about this. So yeah, we're at the end of the piece here, and I'll just finish up by reading the last paragraph. Mr. Tate waited for months for the committee, that's the Senate Armed Services Committee, to call back and give him an indication that it was actively looking at the case. This week, he said with a sigh that he was still waiting. So the Senate Armed Service Committee is dragging its heels on this. Apparently, Elizabeth Warren is vociferously calling for an investigation into what happened, but she's not one to be vociferous even when she's trying to be. So I don't think that there's going to be much of the military hewing to her demands. So what we have here in the end is a huge war crime that was carried out by a secret, unaccountable military task force illegally in Syria, along with the rest of the U.S. military presence. And civilians were killed en masse, but because they're Syrians, because they may or may not have ties to Islamic State, their lives don't matter. How many were killed don't matter. And again, kudos to the Times for breaking this story. But if you read through it yourself, you'll see there are a lot of apologetics, a lot of playing with language to downplay what happened. And it's obvious why that's the case, given how good of a bedfellow the New York Times is with both the U.S. military and intelligence apparatuses. So this is a story that we're going to keep following because what's happening in Syria has been happening for a long time, and massive crimes have been committed by the West. and they need to be brought to light. There needs to be justice for those crimes, however that might manifest. And Syria, as many of you may well know, is still in a state of complete shambles due to this war, which is still ongoing. Don't let that statement about victory over the Islamic State Caliphate fool you into thinking that everything has ended in Syria. It's still very much going on. The U.S. is still very much illegally occupying, particularly the northeastern part of the country where the oil fields are. So this is a huge piece of an ongoing story, and we'll definitely continue our coverage of it. But again, in the meantime, I encourage everybody who's watching to read that New York Times piece. And then just to wrap up on this, if you switch over to the press TV piece.
Can I just make a couple quick
Yeah, absolutely.
comments on this? Because as I was reading, or as you were reading through this, as I read through this last night, the hearing the kind of the banter that went on their secure chat system about how we just dropped on 50 women and children, it was so reminiscent of the collateral murder video.
Yes.
And how dismissive they are about human life and how it's almost video game-ish to them. That really struck me. And also just the paragraph in which the New York Times talks about how they acquired this information, how they ended up breaking this piece. I'll read it again. The Times investigation found that the bombing had been called in by a classified American Special Operations Unit, Task Force 9, which was in charge of ground operations in Syria. The task force operated. Oh, hold on. I think I'm reading the wrong one. Where I just lost it. Oh, I'm sorry. The details of the strikes were pieced together by the New York Times over months from confidential documents and descriptions of classified reports, as well as interviews with personnel directly involved and officials with top secret security clearances who discussed the incident on the condition that they not be named. That's called journalism, and that's what Julian Assange is currently being held in Belmarsh prison for. And so if it can happen to Julian Assange, New York Times, I'm speaking to you, it can and will happen to you. It's less likely to happen to them because, as Jesse said, they are so thoroughly ingrained into the military-industrial complex and intelligence agency kind of sphere. But that is no different than anything that Julian Assange has done. That is exactly what journalists are supposed to do. You're supposed to go and find classified reports and information and sources and all of those things to expose the crimes and corruption of power. And that is why Julian Assange is in prison. And that is a bad thing.
Yeah, so, and it's worth pointing out that one of the co-authors of this piece is Eric Schmidt, who is infamously a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. So once again, take that for what you will.
Yes.
But again, we'll be following up on this story. And just to wrap, can you go to that press TV
Yes, I'm
piece?
doing that now.
Because this is the most recent development, and you'll see where this is going. Pentagon chief, that's Lloyd Austin Jr., I believe, the third. He just ordered a review this week of that strike in Baghouz. So if you scroll down a little bit, I just want to make sure I got his name right. Oh, they just say Lloyd Austin. I know he's the third. I don't know. I guess if he's the third, he is a junior by default. But yeah, essentially what's happening here, I'll read the bold print. Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin has ordered a review of that airstrike in Baghouz that killed 70 people. Again, the number is vacillating, including dozens of women and children, following recent calls for the investigation into the deadly attack that was exposed by the media. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said on Monday that General Michael Garrett, the head of U.S. Army Forces Command, would have 3 months to complete his review on the deadly strike, the compliance of the law of war, and record keeping. So as we're seeing here, the military is essentially investigating itself as it did with the botched strike in Afghanistan at the end of August, which led to nobody being held responsible. And at the risk of sounding cynical, I think that's going to be the outcome here. Nobody is going to be held responsible Task Force 9 will keep operating. As far as I know, is still operating within Syria illegally.
Tate has been held responsible for bringing it up. He's been
Right.
fired. That's the only people that ever get in trouble.
Right. So that's where things stand now, as far as that story goes. But next week we'll have some more information on it, as it's sure to develop, and we will certainly keep our eye on this, because it's important for many reasons, and one of those being that the U.S. is not done with Syria yet. The Syrian people are still very much at risk, from U.S. imperialism, which is very much in bed there with Israel, with Saudi Arabia. And this is essentially Obama's war. It became Trump's war. It's now Biden's war, but it's Obama's war, and it's a war that's crossed partisan lines, as most of these wars do, especially these illegal wars. And when all is said and done, if ever is all said and done, and we actually get a total count of civilians killed over all of these years, it's sure to be massive. And this strike in Baghouz is sure to feature heavily in
That's
whatever
actually
those
something else I
developments
wanted
might
to
be.
bring up, because you mentioned that they're very shifty about how they report these things. Again, something that I don't hate to harp on Julian Assange, because that's what I do. But that's very much of what WikiLeaks has done, especially in Iraq. There were 15,000 civilian deaths that were added to the Iraq body count. And so we know that this is what they do. They desperately try to fudge the numbers and make things, whitewash it as much as possible. And so we are in desperate need of more reporting like this, whether it's from the New York Times. I mean, as Jesse said, they're very good at, using language to, prettify things in a certain way. But even still, just having these kind of things brought to the forefront of people's consciousness, to know that these are the things that the military is doing, that they are hiding civilian deaths on a regular basis. So I think it's a very important thing. And again, it's something that, Julian Assange has done quite well.
Yeah. And just to reiterate that the military investigating itself is what's happening all over again, and we know where that leads. And it just points to the fact that the U.S. imperial war machine is still very much able to kill with impunity, no matter how high the casualty count. And that's something despicable that we need to not just pay attention to, but also resist in any way we can. And if Assange were free and WikiLeaks were functioning at full capacity, it makes one wonder what more information we would have about what happened in Baghouz. So
we need 1,000 WikiLeaks across the globe operating at full functioning capacity. As I've said before, that's my dream world. I mean, my dream world is where we don't have people in positions of power, so that they don't have the opportunity to use that power for nefarious needs. But if we're going to have people in positions of power, there's going to be corruption, and people in positions of power are going to desperately attempt to have their secrets kept secret. And so we need 1,000 WikiLeaks across the globe actively working to expose those secrets and keeping those people in positions of power in check. Those people should be terrified to step out of line. They should be afraid every day to do anything corrupt. That's where we should be at. And instead we penalize the truth tellers and the whistleblowers, and the people who commit the war crimes go on Ellen and get book deals. So that's something that we as a society need to figure out how the fuck we get to flip that, because we need to flip that quickly.
Yep, absolutely. So just keeping on the Middle East quickly, I'd like to go to what's been happening in Yemen recently.
Another huge story that never gets talked about. I'm going to share this for you guys as well. Please don't forget about Yemen. I know there's a lot going on. But Yemen is an extremely important story.
So this is from Middle East Eye. As most of you probably know, Saudi Arabia has been carrying out a bombing campaign in Sana'a, which is in the north of the country. It's the capital. The Houthi rebels have been advancing on it for quite some time and are essentially close to taking it, which is why we see Saudi ramping up its campaigns, its bombing campaigns. So this past week or so, those campaigns really ramped up. You see a photograph there from Sana'a, dated 27 November 2021. So if we go down a little bit, it starts off by saying the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. Again, here we go with such and such led coalitions. The Saudis, the US, the UK, France, these are the players in the coalition. They should all be named every time this is brought up, but that's not a criticism of Middle East Eye. That's just an observation. So anyway, this Saudi-led coalition in Yemen said it had struck a, quote, secret site belonging to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as it launched air raids on the capital, Sana'a. State TV, I'll read through this, it's a short piece. State TV quoted the coalition on Tuesday as saying it had hit the Iranian site while bombing, quote, legitimate targets belonging to Houthi fighters in the capital. The coalition asked civilians not to gather around or approach potential targets. So I'm just going to stop right there and just point out I don't even have the adjective for it, but it's very reminiscent of what Israel does before it bombs civilian centers. It gives the civilians warning to stay away from potential targets. And given that with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, everything is a potential target. It really means nothing, and that you have no place to hide, and you're probably going to be an injured casualty or a murdered casualty. And then, as you see, the raids, these Saudi-led coalition raids are they've been carried out several times over this month. This is dated in November, so this is speaking about November, but this, of course, is still ongoing. And this gets into the Marib offensive. The Houthis have repeatedly launched cross-border attacks on Saudi Arabia using drones and missiles since the coalition intervened in Yemen in March 2015 after the movement ousted the Saudi-backed government from the capital. There, it's worth noting that this war has actually been going on since the end of 2014, so almost 7 years now. The Saudis didn't get involved until several months into the war. And although the Houthis initially had little or no links with Iran, the conflict is widely seen to have developed into a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic. So in Marib, the Houthis are pressing an offensive, and Marib is the internationally recognized government's last northern stronghold, as well as in other areas in Yemen. And that internationally recognized government is, of course, recognized by Saudi Arabia. And this has caused a massive displacement of civilians. There's a quote here from Khaled Al-Shajani, Deputy Director of the Executive Unit for Management of Internally Displaced Persons, IDPs, in Marib. And he told the Middle East Eye that the Houthis are engaged in, quote, forced displacement, unquote. Quote, before 2015, 450,000 people in total lived in Marib Governorate. governorate. Since then, the number of IDPs alone has reached 2.2 million people. During the last 3 months, more than 93,000 people have been displaced, bringing the total to over 2.3 million displaced people in the city of Marib since 2015, he said. So obviously, we're not there on the ground, but to attribute that solely to the Houthis, I think is a bit disingenuous, especially when it's the Saudis who have the air power and are bombing civilian centers knowingly. But there, I reckon, is some truth to what he's saying. I don't want to paint the Houthis as immune from committing crimes themselves, but when one weighs the proportions of what's been happening, it's heavily weighted on the Saudi side. So I suspect that displacement has more to do with the Saudi bombings than with Houthi resistance. So down near the end here, we get to some really rich points. In February, U.S. President Joe Biden announced the end of U.S. support for offensive operations by the Saudi-led coalition in a major policy reversal from the previous administration. However, the Biden administration approved the sale of 280 AIM-120C air-to-air missiles to Saudi Arabia earlier this month, November, in a deal valued at potentially $650 million, a State Department spokesperson told Middle East Eye. When the State Department approved the sale, a spokesman said it was, quote, fully consistent with the administration's pledge to lead with diplomacy to end the conflict in Yemen. The air-to-air missiles ensure, quote, Saudi Arabia has the means to defend itself from Iranian-backed Houthi air attacks, he said. So again, the hypocrisy, to say the least, of the U.S. is on display right there. Not sure how selling air-to-air missiles to a genocidal Wahhabi regime constitutes diplomacy, but there you have it. So that's something we'll be keeping an eye on too, because Yemen, by and large, has fallen off the radar, especially in the mainstream press. And when the UN, for all of its faults, says that it's the world's worst humanitarian crisis, it is telling the truth. And we need to pay attention to that because it's being carried out in our name.
Yes, 100%. There's actually a really great Twitter page that is raising money for the people of Yemen. I'm not going to vouch for them because I don't like vouching for fundraising efforts that I'm not super familiar with, but their Twitter page is very informative. It's at humanityvo, VO_alt. So Humanity Voice is the name of it, but they're raising money. They have a pinned tweet that says 3.3 million internally displaced people, 24 million need humanitarian aid, 19.7 million lack basic health care, 17.8 million need clean water, 20.1 million are food insecure, 3 million malnourished children and pregnant nursing women. So those, I mean, I know I rattled those off very quickly, but those are each of those are all people. Those are all human beings, children, pregnant women, who are being brutalized. And it's something that, as Jesse said, the Western media has never really paid much attention to Yemen ever, but certainly over the past, 6 months or so, it has completely fallen off the radar. Even some of the alternative sources of information have kind of dropped covering it. So it is something that we need to be paying more attention to and speaking out against, loudly. This is a horrible, this is the worst of humanity happening in real time. And as Jesse said, it's happening in our name. It's happening with our dollars. It's happening our country is directly responsible for what is happening to Yemen. And I don't know anybody who has any ounce of humanity at all who would be okay with that. So, we're definitely going to be covering this further, moving forward. It's something that we need to talk about on a more frequent basis. So,
and of course, Ro Khanna, who once found it fashionable to speak out against this genocidal war, is nowhere to be seen or heard with regard to this. So that just speaks to the level of cynicism within the U.S. government when it comes to such U.S. proxy wars. They're used as political footballs of convenience and then quickly forgotten about when they're no longer convenient, or they put some kind of pressure on a politician's career. So that's why it's important that we and as much independent media as possible stays focused on this, and that we don't forget about the Yemeni people. We don't forget about the Syrians. We don't forget about the Palestinians, because much like what's being done to people in Europe with regard to vaccine brutalization and mandates and lockdowns, what's being done to the people in Yemen, in Syria, in Palestine, in Iraq,
The global south.
the global south. There's no reason why that won't eventually come for us as well. So, but it's not just about us, it's about their humanity, and it's about global humanity.
Well, frankly, it's about our humanity. The fact that we're allowing these things to happen.
Right.
That's about our humanity. Yes, it is about protecting their humanity, but the fact that so many people, that we've normalized this type of behavior, and we've desensitized ourselves to this kind of atrocity, it doesn't speak well to the future of humanity, really.
No, it does not. But the first and very important step to take with all of this is to get informed and speak out about it.
Yes, agreed.
So, shall we move to
our COVID section?
The variant in the room.
Yeah, you guys ready to talk some COVID? Here we go. If we end up booted from YouTube, we are also live on Rockfin. I started the Rockfin stream a little bit late because, I'm still new at this. I'm working on it, guys. But yeah, if it does happen to get taken off of YouTube, we are currently live on Rockfin as well. So you can find us at FOTG on Rockfin, just in case. So where do you want to start first, good sir?
Well, let's start with Omicron, since that's all the rage right now. And
so you want the WHO link?
Yeah, let's start with just exactly what this is according to the source we're supposed to recognize as
authoritative sources,
as the COVID-19 Bible. So this is on the World Health Organization's website. As you can see, it's dated 28 November 2021. And I'll read through this because this is essentially the official global position on Omicron. And you can see within just this brief update the mendacity behind the Omicron narrative and how it's being used to fuel fear and confusion deliberately. So on 26 November 2021, WHO designated the variant B.1.1.529 a variant of concern named Omicron on the advice of WHO's Technical Advisory Group on Virus Evolution, or TAG-VE. This decision was based on the evidence presented to the TAG-VE that Omicron has several mutations and that may have an impact on how it behaves, for example, on how easily it spreads or the severity of illness it causes. Here is a summary of what is currently known. Current knowledge about Omicron. Researchers in South Africa and around the world are conducting studies to better understand many aspects of Omicron and will continue to share the findings of these studies as they become available. So right there, it's worth noting that according to the WHO, this is still a variant that originated or was first identified in South Africa. That is actually not the case. It was Botswana, which is just to the north of South Africa.
And was in Europe before then.
And right, that came out, I believe 2 days ago, that an Omicron case was identified in the Netherlands well before the detection of it in southern Africa. So moving forward to transmissibility, this is where it gets quite interesting, to say the least, especially given the nonstop updates meant to induce fear and confusion from the corporate media about Omicron. It is not yet clear whether Omicron is more transmissible, e.g., more easily spread from person to person compared to other variants, including Delta. The number of people testing positive has risen in areas of South Africa affected by this variant, but epidemiologic studies are underway to understand if it is because of Omicron or other factors. So, right there, read that sentence again. The number of people testing positive has risen in areas of South Africa affected by this variant. So they're not saying that it's the variant itself causing the infections, but the way they word it would lead one to believe that it is, particularly by saying affected by this variant. But then it goes on to say right after that, epidemiologic studies are underway to understand if it is because of Omicron or other factors. So there's a sort of double speak right there, which I think is intentional. This information coming out is meant to confuse people because confusion breeds fear and fear breeds compliance. So if we go down to severity of disease, it is not yet clear whether infection with Omicron causes more severe disease compared to infections with other variants, including Delta. But we're going to go ahead and lock down the borders of countries around the world based on something that is not yet clear in any capacity. Preliminary data suggests that there are increasing rates of hospitalization in South Africa, but this may be due to increasing overall numbers of people becoming infected rather than a result of specific infection with Omicron. Okay, so there's some question about those numbers themselves, but what the WHO is admitting right there, prefacing this sentence with hospitalizations are on the rise, leading you to believe that it's from Omicron, but then once again saying that we're not sure if Omicron is causing this or if it's other infections from other strains. There's currently no information to suggest that symptoms associated with Omicron are different from those from other variants. Now that's just false because, as we'll see in the next piece we bring up, the symptoms are much milder to nearly undetectable than other variants. So that's just medical misinformation on its face right there, coming from the WHO itself. Initial reported infections were among university students. I'm assuming this is in South Africa. Younger individuals who tend to have more mild disease, but understanding the level of severity of the Omicron variant will take days to several weeks. So that, again, is false because, as we mentioned, the initial cases we were made aware of were in Botswana, and they were among 4 vaccinated individuals who were traveling on diplomatic passports, which in and of itself raises lots of questions. So you can see they're playing with words here. Initial reported infections were among university students. So I suppose if those came right after the 4 vaccinated individuals in Botswana who were traveling on diplomatic passports, that they could be considered initial. But this language would lead one to believe that it's among, those crazy and wild university students who just want their freedom and they don't care about the common good.
They're so selfish.
Yeah. So again, but understanding the level of severity of the Omicron variant will take days to several weeks, which is an interesting time frame. So right there, again, they're reiterating that they essentially know nothing about the severity or the transmissibility of Omicron. But then this is the kicker. All variants of COVID-19, so that presumably would include Omicron, including the Delta variant that is dominant worldwide, can cause severe disease or death, in particular for the most vulnerable people, and thus prevention is always key. So the WHO spends 2 paragraphs explaining in a mealy-mouthed way that it essentially knows nothing about Omicron except that its symptoms appear to be very mild to nearly undetectable. But then it has to end with warning us that all variants, presumably including Omicron, can result in severe disease or death. So again, more fear porn on coming from the the globalist Bible of public health. Um, so then it gets into effectiveness of prior SARS-CoV-2 infection. So that would be the effectiveness of antibodies generated by a previous SARS-CoV-2 infection or a previous bout of COVID-19. Preliminary evidence suggests there may be an increased risk of reinfection with Omicron, i.e., people who have previously had COVID-19 could become reinfected more easily with Omicron as compared to other variants of concern, but information is limited. More information on this will become available in the coming days and weeks. Again, interesting timeline. Preliminary evidence, none of that is provided. This is all just very vague speak, if you will. But we do know from multiple peer-reviewed studies that people who have had COVID-19 and recovered have durable, robust immunity from up to 23 different strains of SARS-CoV-2. So, but of course, the WHO isn't going to admit that because, as we see next, they want to keep pushing the vaccines, the effectiveness of vaccines. WHO is working with technical partners, read Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Janssen, to understand the potential impact of this variant on our existing countermeasures, including vaccines. Vaccines remain critical to reducing severe disease and death, which I'm going to stop right there because, as we all know, vaccines, the quote unquote vaccines that are now out from all of the big tech cartels do not protect against transmission or contraction of SARS-CoV-2. Even Lord Fauci himself has admitted that. So all that to say that, sorry, I just lost my place. All that to say that vaccines remaining critical to reducing severe disease and death, including against the dominant circulating variant Delta. That's just another false statement right there. But as we know, the WHO, along with other entities, are incessantly pushing these gene therapies masquerading as vaccines on us. And then it has to reassure us once again that current vaccines remain effective against severe disease and death, even though there is no clinical data whatsoever to back that up. I challenge anybody to try to find it. I've tried. I know a lot of other people who are covering this have tried, and it's not out there. Even some of the most respected doctors in the world who are pushing back against the insane official COVID-19 narrative have acknowledged such. So then we get to effectiveness of current tests. The widely used PCR tests continue to detect infection, including infection with Omicron, as we have seen with other variants as well. Now, that is completely untrue. A PCR test is not able to detect which strain of SARS-CoV-2 one is infected with. Um, it can detect the presence of SARS-CoV-2, but then that sample has to be sent for genomic testing. And that is quite a lengthy process, especially because centers for doing that are few and far between. So, Sajid Javid, who we mentioned earlier, discussing Assange, who's now the UK health minister, he recently stated, I believe it was in a Daily Mail piece or a BBC piece, I'm forgetting, but Ryan Christian on The Last American Vagabond has covered this quite well. He's come out and said that we're fortunate with Omicron because it's easily detectable by PCR tests. That's not true. PCR tests do not detect any strain whatsoever, whether it's Omicron, whether it's Delta, whether it's Alpha, whether it's Beta. And then just really quick, going back to the vaccines, it's worth pointing out that the injections currently out there are formulated only to combat against the Alpha variant or the Wuhan strain, the original strain, which is going by the Delta fear porn, no longer in circulation. So anybody taking in the injection is taking in one that is for a non-existent, if you will, strain of the virus, and will have no effect against Delta, against Omicron. So studies are ongoing to determine whether there is any impact on other types of tests, including rapid antigen detection tests, effectiveness of current treatments. And here it's a little bit surprising that the WHO would acknowledge that there are treatments for COVID-19, although as you see, they don't list ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, or vitamin regimens as being a part of that. Corticosteroids and IL-6 receptor blockers will still be effective for managing patients with severe COVID-19. Other treatments will be assessed to see if they are still as effective given the changes to parts of the virus in the Omicron variant. So that just seems like a token gesture on behalf of the WHO. Not even sure why they put that in there. It's so vague as to mean almost nothing. And then we get to the fact that there are studies underway. At the present time, WHO is coordinating with a large number of researchers around the world to better understand Omicron. You can bet those researchers are Pfizer researchers, Moderna researchers, etc. Studies currently underway or underway shortly, because this is such a variant of concern that we do still have a window, a short one at that, but to study this. Include assessments of transmissibility, severity of infection, including symptoms, performance of vaccines and diagnostic tests, and effectiveness of treatments. So therefore, once again, the WHO admitting that it knows nothing about this Omicron variant, even as we're pounded over the head with each individual case that pops up anywhere in the world. WHO encourages countries to contribute the collection and sharing of hospitalized patient data through the WHO COVID-19 clinical data platform to rapidly describe clinical characteristics and patient outcomes. More information will emerge in the coming days and weeks. WHO's TAG-VE will continue to monitor and evaluate the data as it becomes available and assess how mutations in Omicron alter the behavior of the virus. So they're more vague, admitting that they don't know anything about this yet. So recommended actions for countries. As Omicron has been designated a variant of concern, there are several actions WHO recommends countries to undertake, including enhancing surveillance and sequencing of cases. Sounds just fine. Surveillance. Sharing genome sequences on publicly available databases such as GIS, AID. which is what I believe the doctor, as we'll see in the next piece, who detected this in South Africa did. She immediately reported it to the WHO, which good on her for doing so, as that's the proper protocol. Reporting initial cases or clusters to WHO, performing field investigations and laboratory assessments to better understand if Omicron has different transmission or disease characteristics or impacts effectiveness of vaccines, therapeutics, which is interesting, diagnostics, or public health and social measures. More detail in the announcement from 26 November. Countries should continue to implement the effective public health measures to reduce COVID-19 circulation overall, using a risk analysis and science-based approach. They should increase some public health and medical capacities to manage an increase in cases. WHO is providing countries with support and guidance for both readiness and response. In addition, it is vitally important that inequities in access to COVID-19 vaccines are urgently addressed to ensure that vulnerable groups everywhere, including health workers and older persons, receive their first and second dose alongside equitable access to treatment and diagnostics. So that right there is pointing to specifically Africa, where COVID-19 cases and deaths, the rates have been extremely low. And that corresponds almost directly with the fact that most of Africa has no interest in taking the
Western vaccines.
the injections. And that's both based on the fact that they remember history and how they've been experimented on countless times in the past, and what they're seeing happening to people who receive these injections. They're getting sick, severely sick. They're dying. They're still contracting and transmitting COVID-19. And even the AP has reported on this, although claiming in its headline that it's a mystery to scientists and doctors as to why COVID-19 rates remain so low in Africa. And it's worth noting that there is a big push among the liberal intelligentsia and their hipster mandarins to get equitable access to vaccines in places like Africa. And it's for no good reason. It's for no health reason. These people are pushing an agenda. It's a globalist agenda that goes far beyond health, actually has nothing to do with health when you examine it in full. But people like Kyle Kulinski, people like Walker Bragman, who's really not even worth mentioning here, but these people do have influence on social media and walk around with a self-anointed air of credibility. They're pushing for places like Africa to be more quote unquote vaccinated, regardless of whether or not the people there want it. So
colonizers.
So this is this paragraph here is directly pointing toward that. And then just to wrap up with what the WHO said, its recommended actions for people. Here we go again. The most effective steps individuals can take to reduce the spread of COVID-19 virus is to keep a physical distance of at least 1 meter from others, because COVID won't go any farther than half a meter.
Carries around a measuring stick.
Yeah. Wear a well-fitting mask. Masks have been proven to do absolutely nothing in stopping the transmission of COVID-19. The particles are, of SARS-CoV-2. The particles are so small, they go right through the mask. And as Dr. Michael Palmer, who's at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, has pointed out, wearing a mask that's like throwing sand at a chain link fence when it comes to particles being blocked by the mask. So, and not only that, they're extremely harmful to our respiratory systems.
They're gross.
They can contribute to pneumonia. And when it comes to masking kids, there are so many detrimental effects of that, from learning social cues to their developing respiratory systems. Um, any recommendation at this point to wear a well-fitting mask is not only unfounded in science, it's dangerous and even criminal, one could argue. Here we go again with opening windows to improve ventilation, because, COVID will just find its way out. Avoid poorly ventilated or crowded spaces. Keep hands clean. Cough or sneeze into a bent elbow or tissue, and get vaccinated when it's their turn. Again, here it's about pushing these pseudo vaccinations. And rest assured that the WHO will continue to provide updates as more information becomes available, because obviously they have none right now, including following meetings of the TAG VE. In addition, information will be available on WHO's digital and social media platforms. So all of that to say that Omicron right now is essentially less than a nothing burger. But there's a problem with this narrative being constantly pumped out, the fear being constantly ratcheted up, that this is the one. This is the one that's going to overtake all of us. This is the Black Plague of variants. And it's not just that it's being used to impose colonial bio-warfare on places like Africa. If you can pull up the Telegraph article. Yeah, I won't read through the whole thing, but I encourage people to read this piece. But when you ratchet up the fear with these variants and you impose lockdowns and other unnecessary measures, oh, sorry, I'll jump to this first. I won't read through the whole thing, but here is the South African doctor, Angelique Coetzee. Coetzee is actually how it's pronounced. Who raised alarm about Omicron variant, says symptoms are, quote, unusual but mild. And if you read through that piece on the Telegraph, which is actually available for free, so it's not behind a paywall.
Rare these days.
Yeah. Although the other Telegraph piece that we'll bring up next is so.
Oh, did I get the wrong one? Sorry.
No. This is fine. This is going off the what the WHO is saying. That this is severely mild. Let's see if you can go down a little bit.
Their symptoms were so different and so mild from those I had treated before.
Yeah, and if we go down,
feeling so tired.
Yeah, and here we have Sajid Javid. We don't have to play that video, but he's who we referenced earlier. So here we go. Here's one quote from Dr. Coetzee. We had one very interesting case, a kid about 6 years old with a temperature and a very high pulse rate, and I wondered if I should admit her, but when I followed up 2 days later, she was so much better. Again, pointing out that this is far from a variant of concern, at least at this point. Even children who are the new test subjects for the injections are recovering from this variant within days. What else does she go on to say? Okay, then the Telegraph has to scare us with the fact that 2 cases of Omicron exist in the UK. It is the most mutated form of COVID-19 discovered thus far, with 32 mutations to the spike protein. Scientists are concerned that the mutation may allow it to evade existing vaccines and spread quickly. But again, there's no information on that whatsoever, as the WHO has
And thus
itself
far, the
been.
symptoms are incredibly mild. So why are we fear mongering about it?
Right. So going down to that paragraph, the UK, the US, the EU. So this is where we start to get into the consequences of this fear mongering, this informationless, non-information based fear mongering, if you will. The UK, US, the EU, and Israel have all suspended travel to and from South Africa and the 5 surrounding countries: Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Mozambique, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. Those are actually 6 countries, so not sure why they say 5. The UK government added Angola, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia to the travel red list on Sunday. The Western travel ban has provoked anger among South Africans, with many claiming that they are being punished for having outstanding research institutions and being transparent about their findings, which I think they have an argument there.
Dr. Fauci was even called out in a press conference recently about this, and he had no answer for why these travel restrictions were being put in place. He was asked directly, why, if it's not, we know it's not coming from South Africa, if we know that it's not, why are they, and he had no answer again to why that is a thing that's happening.
Yeah. So moving on to the consequences of all this fear porn, I'll start by pointing out that a few days ago, when the first Omicron case was detected in California, the stock market dropped by 500 points, which shows just how volatile, to use market speak, this fear porn is making things. And it's fear porn based on no scientific data whatsoever. But there are also other severely negative consequences to this. So if you can bring up that other Telegraph piece.
The archived one?
Yeah, I'll just point this out, because this is quite astonishing, and I don't think it's limited to the UK. So the Telegraph points out, quote, biggest cancer catastrophe ever, unquote, to hit NHS, as up to 740,000 potential cases missed. Quote, devastating, unquote, situation for patients as waiting lists set to rise further and medics fear that, quote, more people will die who don't need to, unquote. So that headline and subheadline are a little vague, but if you just read the first paragraph, you'll see what's happening here. Up to 740,000 potential cancer cases that should have been urgently referred by GPs have been, quote, missed, unquote, since the first lockdown back in 2020, according to a damning report. So what's happening here is that people are afraid to follow up with doctors and other medical professionals regarding potential cancer cases they may have been diagnosed with. And that number is growing. There's a huge waiting list right now that the NHS really doesn't have a chance in hell of getting to. You can see here that watchdogs are warning that the NHS waiting lists could keep growing until 2025, which is earlier than we'll see the Pfizer clinical trial data, but still a ways away. So I'm just scrolling through here for some of the main points. Yeah, you're seeing here that this is a growing problem, and it's putting people's health at risk with one of the most serious diseases one can contract, that being cancer. And if you scroll down a little bit, and I encourage people to read this piece too. This is another a bit of a long one. So here we have the NAO. I believe that's the National Accountability Office, estimates a shortfall of between 240,000 and 740,000 missing referrals as a result of people struggling to get appointments with GPs or keeping away from the NHS for fear of COVID or being a burden on services. So you can
I'm
see,
sure if we keep firing doctors and nurses who refuse to comply, I'm sure that'll help that go faster. It's fine.
yeah, that's also a huge factor in this
Yeah.
too. So you can see what kind of uh, damage this is causing to people's health, and it's not COVID-19 that's causing the damage. It's government policies, draconian. I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but these really are draconian policies on behalf of the government that are causing this problem. And I'll end on this here with this quote. This is something we keep hearing. If you can just go up a tiny bit, back up. So this is from Meg Hillier, chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. She says, quote, "Things will get worse before they get better, with the NAO estimating that waiting lists will be even longer by 2025." So here we go again, as we heard in early 2020 when lockdowns began, and then all the other pointless measures that followed, that things are going to get worse before they get better. So in other words, prepare for dark winter 2021, lockdowns, social distancing. In Europe, we're already seeing this insanity ratcheted up to unbelievable levels I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. Austria locking down both the quote vaccinated and quote unvaccinated, mandating vaccinations for everybody by February 2020. Germany has just taken steps toward a similar state of affairs. And our good friend Pierce Robinson lives in Berlin. We've been in touch with him, and he and his family are being very severely affected by this. And of course, they're not the only family being severely affected by these fascistic government policies. So again, that article is well worth reading. And then if you can just bring up the RT one to finish up this point on how detrimental this hysteria over Omicron is, and what it's doing to people's health. One Omicron case, this is in Portugal, triggers a 2-week shutdown of children's emergency ward. So because of this variant about which even the WHO admits we know nothing, and cases worldwide, I don't even think they've reached 50 yet, although I could be wrong with that. In any case, the amount is extremely low. And as we just pointed out, the symptoms are mild to almost undetectable. Because of that, and because of the fear surrounding it, children's wards are being shut down, ostensibly to protect the children. But what this points out is that decisions made under fear are always irrational decisions, and they lead to dire consequences, such as affecting the health of children. I mean, just think about that. Think about what we know about Omicron, and whether or not that justifies shutting down a children's ward for 2 weeks because one doctor there has this very mild strain of SARS-CoV-2, and children who have very robust immune systems, although maybe these children are immunocompromised, they're not going to be able to receive the treatment they need because of Omicron, the Omicron Leviathan that is apparently going to be the end of all humanity. So every time you hear a danger story about Omicron, remember that it's more than just overblown. At this point, it's based on no scientific data whatsoever. The WHO itself admits that. What you didn't see on that WHO page is something that it conceded earlier this week, that it doesn't necessarily stand opposed to, but it doesn't see any reason for the travel bans based on what's known about Omicron so far. So even the WHO, as it admits we know nothing, also has to concede that these measures being put in place by mostly Western countries are unnecessary and utterly ridiculous. But this is surely going to keep developing, because, as we said, there are people out there who are pushing this for whatever reasons, as the end-all be-all of COVID-19, and it's time to go back to square one. And that's absolutely not the case. So we're going to stay on that and keep you up to date as best we can with the actual information and reading between the lines of what these official sources are saying. So moving from there, Misty, I know you have a piece about more of the politics, I suppose you could say, that are involved in.
Well, this is something that
COVID-19.
Yeah, I've been speaking to my friend Daniel on Twitter. He's from the UK. He's one of my favorite people. I love him so much. He's an amazing artist too. But the left has utterly and completely failed. I'm going to try to just very briefly go through this because we have been going for over 2 hours. I know that's a long time. I'm sorry, you guys. This is our first show, so we're going to have to tweak it and figure out timing and all that stuff. But this article I highly recommend. It's from unheard.com. And it really just discusses the absolute and utter failure of the left on this issue. And the way that you guys know, I like to talk about propaganda and narrative control and, the way that they're able to manipulate people based on fear and all of those different things. And the left has really fallen victim to this over the course of the pandemic. So I'm going to read just some of this briefly. I'm really not going to go through it all. It's a long article, but it is very well worth your time. Throughout the various phases of the global pandemic, people's preferences in terms of oh my god, why can't I say that word?
Epidemiological.
Thank you. I don't know why I can't say that word.
You just got to jump into it really fast, and
I guess. Let's just let it roll out.
Yeah.
Strategies have tended to overlap closely with their political orientation ever since Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro expressed doubts as to the wisdom of a lockdown strategy in March 2020. Liberals and those on the left of the Western political spectrum, including most socialists, have fallen over themselves to adhere in public to the lockdown strategy of pandemic mitigation and lately to the logic of vaccine passports. Now, as countries across Europe experiment with tighter restrictions of the unvaccinated, left-wing commentators, usually so vocal in defense of minorities suffering from discrimination, are notable for their silence. And that's a really great opening paragraph, because that's really what the problem is that, the left has generally been historically on the side of the little guy, of the side of minorities being oppressed, right? All of these draconian, as we said, that's a very overused word, but all of these draconian measures impact minorities and oppressed populations more drastically. And so the fact that we are being kind of led down this path and the left is epically failing to speak out against it has really been quite depressing for me. And I know for other people, like my friend Daniel, who we talk about this all the time on Twitter. So let's see. It just really goes down into talking about, how once Donald Trump expressed a skepticism about lockdowns and all of those things, all of a sudden the liberal and the left political side of the spectrum, immediately it was, anything that's Donald Trump, you have to be opposed to, right? You can't agree with Donald Trump. You can't be a leftist and agree with Donald Trump, right? That's ridiculous. That's not ridiculous. Donald Trump is going to occasionally say things that are true, accurate, and correct. It doesn't mean that he's a good person. It doesn't mean that I agree with him politically, but when he's right, it's okay to say that he's right. I love that they also touch here on the social media aspect. Social media algorithms then further fueled this polarization very quickly. Therefore, Western leftists embrace lockdown, seen as, quote, pro-life and, quote, pro-collective choice, a policy that in theory championed public health or the collective right to health. Meanwhile, any criticism of the lockdowns was extricated as right-wing, pro-economy, and pro-individual approach, accused of prioritizing prioritizing profit and business as usual over people's lives. That's ridiculous because these lockdowns have had a unbelievably detrimental effect on people's lives. It's not about profit. It's not about business as usual. It's about the fact that, people have been you're stuck in your house. How many instances of abuse have risen? How many the suicide rate has risen dramatically. This is something that the left has really been shying away from talking about, and it's really weird to me. Like, watching this has been really weird over the past two and a half, like however long it's been. How the fuck long? It's been like almost 2 years, right? March-ish will be 2 years.
Yeah. And Jacobin, of course, has been one of the leading media platforms in pushing for lockdowns and mandatory injections. And it's, I just want to point out, this piece is one of the co-authors is Toby Green, who's done who's been doing some really good work, especially on lockdowns and here with the left-right divide. And he was recently a guest on Max Blumenthal's show Foreign Agents on Rockfin. So I recommend everybody watching check out that episode. They especially with regard to lockdowns, which are probably in store for a lot of us very soon.
Yes.
He breaks down the destructive dynamics of that really well. And also the Gray Zone just published a piece on the destructiveness of lockdowns. I believe it was published yesterday. Max Blumenthal and I'm forgetting her name. She's a Greek writer, but they collaborated on it. I haven't read the piece yet, but it looks to be very good. So yeah, this is coming from people who have been studying,
and
analyzing.
A leftist, self-identified,
right,
left-leaning people. This is not like people on the right, making comments about what the left is doing. These are left-leaning people who are very, who have observed the same stuff that I've been observing. Mm-hmm. So this paragraph really just kind of breaks down exactly what the leftists seem to have forgotten. But why has the mainstream left ended up supporting practically all COVID measures? How did such a simplistic view of the relationship between health and the economy emerge? One which makes a mockery of decades of left-leaning social science research, showing just how closely wealth and health outcomes are connected. Why did the left ignore the massive increase in inequalities, the attack on the poor, on poor countries, on women and children, the cruel treatment of the elderly, and the huge increase in wealth for the richest individuals and corporations resulting from these policies? How, in relation to the development and rollout of vaccines, did the left end up ridiculing the very notion that giving the money at stake, and when BioNTech, Moderna, and Pfizer currently make between them over $1,000 per second from the COVID vaccines, there might be motivations from the vaccine manufacturers other than, quote, the public good at play? And how is it possible that the left, often on the receiving end of state repression, today seems oblivious to the worrying ethical and political implications of COVID passports? So again, this article is very long. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know we've gone kind of long, but I highly recommend reading this article and really thinking about this because, again, this is something that historically the left has been really good about doing, about seeing through the bullshit and seeing through the narratives that are being pushed. But in like today's political climate, again, there's such this polarization and there's such this team mentality that if anybody on the other team says something, you must immediately disagree with it, or you are seen as other, or you're not left enough, or you're not, you can't be included. If you're guilty of quote unquote wrong think on any given issue, then you're shunned, you're ostracized from the group. And that's a really huge problem that I've seen on the left. And I think that COVID has been a monumental exposing instance of that, where it's been very apparent that that's the, it's you either agree with me 100% of the time, or you can't be on my team. And so this article really, really dives deep into those questions about what is causing the left to sort of ignore these factors. What is the driving force behind this sort of team mentality, and how we can kind of sort of move past this. It's really been, I mean, this is they talk here about the shock doctrine. This is a great part of it. More famously, in her 2007 book, The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein explored the idea of, quote, disaster capitalism. Her central thesis is that in moments of public fear and disorientation, it is easier to re-engineer societies. Dramatic changes to the existing economic order, which would normally be politically impossible, are imposed in rapid-fire succession before the public has had time to understand what is happening. And that is exactly what's going on, you guys. I know that people like to talk about the Great Reset as if it's some, crazy conspiracy theory. This is exactly what they're doing. They've been very open about it. In fact, I don't know how anybody could justify calling this a conspiracy theory when they are on multiple people in this sort of group of wealthy scumbags are on camera in multiple interviews. They've written books about how they wish to kind of reorder society. And it is happening to us right now. We're living in it right now. And so many people are not only complying, they're actively cheering it on. People who should know better. And so this is a really...
And what's cruelly ironic here with regard to Naomi Klein is that she's absolutely spot on in that thesis, but she's essentially turned her back on it and is now affiliated with the World Economic Forum, which is one of the, if not the primary driver behind the agenda that is exploiting COVID-19 to realize itself.
Well, and this paragraph here brings up another point too. Ultimately, any form of government action should be judged for what it actually stands for. We support government intervention if it serves to further the rights of workers and minorities, to create full employment, to provide crucial public services, to rein in corporate power, to correct the dysfunctionalities of markets, to take control of crucial industries and the public interest. But in the past 18 months, we have witnessed the exact opposite, an unparalleled strengthening of transnational corporate behemoths and their oligarchs at the expense of workers and local businesses. A report last month based on Forbes data showed that the American billionaires alone have seen their wealth increase by $2 trillion during the pandemic. And this is what I'm talking about. None of these measures, none of the lockdowns, none of the vaccine passports, none of this shit, it's all arbitrary. It's all selectively applied. You'll notice that none of these things apply to people in power. We've seen it at the Met Gala. We've seen it at the dinner that Nancy Pelosi hosted. We saw it with Matt Hancock was caught like roaming around town when they were supposed to be under lockdown. It doesn't apply to them. And so none of this stuff is for the workers. None of this stuff is for, and again, I'm going to say it again. If it was about public health, we would have been given healthcare by now. We're almost 2 years into a quote unquote global pandemic that's oh so terrible that we have to lock the world down. We still don't have healthcare in the richest country in the world. If that doesn't expose it for the ridiculousness that it is, I don't know what will. And so that the left is just completely buying into this unquestioningly really is what's happening. And that's what's so disturbing is that they're just being force-fed this information, and Donald Trump said the opposite. So they just like climb right on board and they don't question it. And then if you question it, you're called an anti-vaxxer and you're called anti-science and you're called a Trumper and you're a right-winger. And they've managed to kind of portray the anti-mandate population as alt-right. Like if you go to an anti-mandate protest, then you are alt-right. That's if you look at any of the coverage of any of these protests, they are all deemed to be right-wing. These are all right-wing protests. And that's not true at all. There are people across the political spectrum who are speaking out against this stuff. So the fact that, the quote unquote left in the United States, at least, is so actively buying into this without questions, without any reservations, is really something to behold. And it really does speak to, again, the quality of their propaganda game. They are very, very, very good at this. They are a million steps ahead of us. And so this is something that we really need to start calling attention to. I know that it's very difficult, especially publicly, to go against the grain and to ask questions of people when there's kind of this accepted narrative that you're only allowed to speak on. But we have to start actively fighting back against this. We have to start actively calling out people who are buying into this, who are pushing this. It's dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous what's happening right now. We are in the midst of a restructuring of society. We are in the midst of devastation being just wrought upon the most vulnerable amongst us. This is affecting the most vulnerable amongst us. Again, something that the left used to champion against. We used to be, we were the ones who would stand up for those people, and that's not happening now. And so we really, I know it's difficult to kind of go against the grain. I know it's difficult to stand out from the crowd, but we need more people actively fighting against this whole left capitulation to what's happening right now. It's incredibly dangerous. And yes, Naomi Klein is definitely controlled opposition, and she's been floating, like she's been riding off of that book, The Shock Doctrine, her entire career. It's about the only thing that I like from her. But yes, she is controlled opposition, and so many of these people are. So what's happening is really dangerous. I highly recommend reading that whole article though from unheard.com. It is very good, very well written. It asks a lot of really probing questions. I'm going to put all of the links of all of the articles that we talked about today in the description. It's not there now because, again, this is our first one and I was a little all over the place. So they will be there shortly as soon as I get them all copy and pasted in there so you guys can read all of the articles that we discussed and share them with your friends if you'd like. Have these conversations. That's what we're hoping to do here, is just kind of facilitate conversations about these issues that are often overlooked. So, yeah,
and
that's...
if anybody watching has any stories they feel are important or would like to see us cover, please reach out to either of us or both of us on Twitter. My DMs are open. I think Misty, yours are.
No.
Oh, they're not. Okay.
Hell no, dude.
Yeah.
Do you see the number of trolls I get? Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
But people can feel free to reach out to me if they have any ideas. And because we're always looking to cover what's being missed, and we are just as capable of missing lots of things as anybody else. So
especially when I get singularly focused on Assange stuff, so sometimes it's hard for me to pop my head out of that bubble.
Yeah, and I think we'd both like this to be a not just us speaking, but a participatory show in which our audience plays a part, because you all are just as important in getting this information out as we are. So
yeah, for sure, my friends. So yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed the first Facts on Friday. I think it's going to be it's going to take us a little while to kind of iron out kinks, and it was really difficult actually to narrow down what stories. There's a lot. There's a lot that we could be talking about. It was really difficult to kind of narrow down our focus here. So hopefully we'll iron out those kinks as we move forward. It will be a little bit smoother. We'll be able to, I'm hoping to be able to develop slides for different things so we don't have to scroll through entire articles, all of that stuff. So we're going to be working on improving, the quality of the show as we move forward. So if you guys have anything if you have suggestions, if you have anything we're open to suggestions, we're open to constructive criticism always. So hopefully you enjoyed the first Facts on Friday, and you can find us here again next week on Friday at 4:00 Eastern. And we will have another jam-packed full show again, because there's never a dull moment, I think. So thanks everybody for joining us in the chat. We really appreciate you. And we will see you next week. Bye guys.